more familiar faces now. As you know, that was seen from my emails as well, and just looking at the Meetup page, this was completely booked out. I see there's about 30 people here still. I'm still trying to work out how that whole thing works. And we had a waiting list of like 20 people as well. But decent crowds, as I'm doing this every month, or trying to do it every month, as you know, obviously people can rely on it and then you keep coming along. So thanks a lot for coming along. We've got 3 talks for this session again. The first one is from Graham Odds, who is actually working here at ScotLogic, our new sponsor that's helping us to get a venue and get everyone kind of fed and watered and then come along to these events. Our second speaker is Michael Hagney, a consultant in the industry for the past 20 years, you're saying? Give or take. Give or take 19. No, but the past 20 years. And then our third speaker is Sam Dodds here from the app business. And would you say the Tab or the app business? Tab, okay. Tab Group, who have just opened up in Edinburgh. Yeah. Okay. So our third and final speaker. So we've got that to look forward to. And as usual, we'll run through the first 2 talks kind of back to back with kind of time for questions if you have any after each one. And then we'll have like a 5-10 minute recess where you can kind of grab a toilet and get some more to eat or chat away. And then we'll have our third kind of talk after that. And as usual, once I close up the talks, we can all just kind of chat together, talk to your peers and get to know each other. If you've got questions for the speakers, go ahead with that too. Thankfully, this time we've been able to get Alan here from Product Forge team along to actually live stream. So for the people who chose not to turn up or were on the waiting list and didn't think they could turn up, they'll be able to get that feed. But also, does that mean we have a recording of it as well to archive? Cool, so you can look back on the talks. So thanks a lot to Alan, Product Forge. And yeah, so this is our November event, which is because we missed out in October. And then if you've probably seen as well, 4th of December, I'm sure half of you at least have probably snabbed a ticket for that as well, because this one sold out. So we're running that at Amazon next month as well, on our new sponsor. So thanks a lot for coming along to the Interaction Design Association chat again for November. I'll hand off to Graham here for the first talk. And yeah, I'll leave it there. Thanks for Graham.
So, as Marty said, I work here, so it's great to be standing back in my office for the rest of the day. So I've been standing pretty much in this spot all day chatting to people, so my voice is almost definitely going to go now. I'll get the shameless plug out of the way. We're hiring designers, we're hiring testers, we're hiring developers, probably project managers and various other roles as well. Go and look on our website, shameless plug over. On to more interesting stuff in my mind. This is all about data visualization, and I'm not intending to give sort of the answer for how you do data visualization, good or bad. I'm going to sort of share my learnings about how data visualization works, and therefore possibly give you the tools to evaluate good or bad data visualization and figure it out for yourself a little bit on top of that. But before diving into that, I want to start with a story, which I've shamelessly stolen from a book. Very amusing data visualization book where every chart, all the text is in Comic Sans for reasons I don't understand. But the story is a great one. It's about this guy, John Arbuthnot. This portrait is along the road at the Surgeons Gallery, actually. So he's a sort of 17th to 18th century polymath, and he did everything as polymaths in those days did. Apparently inspired part of one of the books in Gulliver's Travels. But he's most well known for a paper he wrote and published, introducing a new statistical method, which he used to argue for divine providence. Now, I'm going to stick clear of talking about divine providence and stick to the data that's actually used in that set. So in his paper, like all good scientists, he includes the data set he used for his argument. So this is it, although in the paper it's one massive long table rather than broken up into these clusters. And as you can see, it's christenings in London over just short of a 100-year period. And he presents it, like I say, in this format, so year by year, male christenings and female christenings in London. And that's lovely. You look at the table and go, well, there's sort of 4s and 5,000s-ish, and then kind of drops down to 3s-ish, and then comes up to 5s and 6s and 7s and 8s. And that's pretty much all you see from the numbers. But if we do what he would never have done it in those days, and that is chart that data. It was like early 1700s before William Playfair published sort of the first well-renowned book that used data visualization extensively. So we plot this data, and where this is different from the table is that suddenly some things jump out at you. Sort of like what's going on in sort of this trough and these peaks. I haven't labelled it clearly. Blue is male christenings and yellow is female. Apologies if anyone's suffering from colour blindness and makes that hard to see. And if you look through history textbooks, there's likely correlating reasons for why some of these drops and changes might exist. So things like wars and plagues, maybe there's fewer people to christen, or people are less in the mood for that kind of ceremony, or less in the mood for the ceremony that eventually ends up with christenings. But you can answer a lot of those kind of points of interest, except for this one on the end, where there's this random trough that sort of comes out of nowhere. And you can read the history textbooks, and you can probably find very tenuous reasons. But if you use the chart for what a chart can do reasonably well, which is you just sort of scan around, there's this one point that's a little bit interesting, that those numbers seem remarkably similar. That's pretty much as far as using this chart can go, and even that's not that obvious. But if we now roll back to the data and look at those specific points, so it's these two highlighted here, what's interesting is the numbers are identical. Now, if you check back to the original data source, which was collected by a guy called John Grout, yeah, this number is wrong. This was a copy and paste error, or the original copy and paste error, as I like to think of it. And that was the basis of an argument for divine providence. So take from that what you will. What I'm trying to highlight with the story, though, is that data visualization is not the answer to everything. It is an answer to the problem of trying to get an overview of something and trying to ask particular questions. You still oftentimes need to get to the raw data or to the details underneath to be able to dig further into that understanding. So I have to preface with that, because everyone otherwise thinks I just do data visualization for everything, which I definitely don't. Right, on to the interesting meat of the talk. So I quite like this definition, data visualization. To me, what it highlights is what many people don't appreciate, is there's actually quite a broad spectrum of purposes for data visualization. The one end, you've got the more analytical, sort of exploratory data analysis side of things, and on the other end, you've got actual communication. So that might be newspapers or websites where you know your story, you just want to make it look good and communicate that to people. But there's everything in between as well, and as all good UX designers know, you need to understand your audience and know where on that spectrum you're trying to pitch it, and that might change what you do entirely. So for data visualization professionals, the idea of speaking to users and understanding them is like blows their mind, and it's a revolutionary thing. For us, I hope we all recognize that's a good thing. I'm not going to talk about that. Now, so what am I going to talk about? These are the things I'm going to talk about, and allegedly how long I'll talk about them for. I've never stuck to these timings ever, but it looks good to have a chart very early on and talk about data visualization. So we're going to start with a bit of cognitive psychology, and for those of you who don't recognize that string of words, you might know where that's going to go. After that, we're going to understand why we use visualization, the sense of visualization, the sense of sight rather than any of our other senses. Assuming you follow that argument to that point, then we need to understand how we see, to then be able to understand how we can communicate and perceive values and relationships through data visualization. So, starting with that first bit. So for those of you who recognize that string of words, and my clicker stopped working, great. Here is a picture. Now, most of you here will probably very quickly recognize that this is probably an upset child. It is my child, and he probably was upset at the time, as he was most of the time in their first year. But without any effort, really, most of us react to that with, we recognize that he's upset. We probably associate it with loud noises, possibly with quite violent movements, possibly with a slight question as to why I'm sitting there with my face just in picture, not reacting to it that much. But it's quite a deep, nuanced interpretation of a bunch of pixels on a screen. Contrast that with this, where similarly we very quickly recognize that this is some multiplication, and that I could probably figure it out if you give me a piece of paper or a calculator. Some people go to the effort of figuring that out. I think it's 408, if I remember my notes correctly. But that's quite a contrast there. So, the filling in the question mark, many people don't do it. It takes a lot of conscious thought, a lot of conscious effort. And yet that's not actually any more detailed or nuanced than this understanding of a bunch of pixels and the sounds and the emotions that might go with that. So what I'm highlighting here is a notion coined by a guy called Daniel Kahneman, who's a Nobel Prize-winning author. A cognitive psychologist, I should say, who wrote a fantastic book called Thinking Fast and Slow. And he characterizes these two ways of thinking into, or two modes of thinking into System 1 and System 2. So System 1 is this sort of always-on, hyperactive, but actually kind of slightly stupid system, the lizard brain side of us that immediately recognizes that was an anguished child, versus the System 2, which is this slower, more learned part of our brain that requires switching on, requires control, requires effort. And when it comes to data visualization, why I bring this up is the ideal is to make these abstract shapes that we use to encode information do as much of their work in System 1 as possible, so that System 2 is freed up to actually do the higher level thinking, not make us sit there just look at a chart and go, okay, I don't even know what those numbers are. I have to read all the text before I can understand anything. So if we do it well, as much of it lives in System 1 as possible. So if you accept that as a starting point, then obviously all of our different senses feed into System 1. So why visualization specifically? This is a visualization taken from a book by David McCandless. And here what he's plotting is the bandwidth of our different senses. So the big blue rectangle is the bandwidth into our eyes. The pink rectangle is our sense of touch. Yellow is our sense of hearing and smell. We've got taste down there in the more saturated pink. And then this tiny, tiny little black box down there. That's our conscious bandwidth. So that's the stuff that actually gets into our brain that we are aware is getting into our brain. So sight has got the most information going in, at least. Now, if we flip to a slightly different visualization of the same information, here we can just see it in slightly more analytical form. And what I can put alongside this is the bandwidth into our conscious mind. So within that little black box that we saw there, which of our senses has the biggest bandwidth in? Now, I have to highlight here, there's quite a big difference in scale. This is millions of bits of information per second. This is bits per second. So although these bars are similar-ish sized, huge orders of magnitude difference in the bandwidth there. Everyone always jumps and recognizes that, hang on, this is interesting. Sound suddenly proportionally is a far bigger bandwidth than some of the others. And again, that's a sort of evolution at play. That's why we all jump when a car backfires or there's a loud noise. It goes straight into our brain and we pick up on it very quickly. But sight still has the biggest bandwidth into our conscious mind. So I guess the argument I'm presenting is that System 1 sort of is the translation from this large amount of information into this smaller set of information before it gets to System 2. So if we can make System 1 as effective as possible, then that translation between those two levels of bandwidth is going to be as effective as possible. So if you're still with me at this point and still somewhat agree, then you can understand that the interesting part is what that actual sort of process of seeing and perceiving, if we can deconstruct that, we can figure out where the System 1 stuff fits in and where it becomes System 2, and therefore how we should try and shape and design our visualization. So I'm going to very crudely say that light goes into our eyes, and we therefore see stuff. I could bore you to tears with some of the biology on this, but I'm not going to. We're going to stay fairly abstract. So as the light comes into our eyes, in huge, I'll say huge parallel information, huge parallel data, it goes into an area of our mind sort of abstractly recognized as iconic memory. Now this is a sort of temporary buffer type of beast. It's starting to try and pick out some of the information in all this data that's flowing in. Some of what it's trying to pick out is features, so that might be edges or parts of colors or particular shapes. Other parts, slightly beyond that, is it's starting to try and pick out patterns, very rough abstract patterns in there. So it's trying to sort some of this information that's flowing in huge, huge quantities into something we can start to actually understand. It passes that filtered, shaped information onto an area of our mind called the visual working memory. Now, visual working memory is, I guess, a lot of people often talk about being able to hold 4 plus or minus 2 things in working memory at any given point. The plus or minus is, I always throw that in because I've read papers that argue for 2 to 3 and up to 7 and all sorts like that. But this is, again, a temporary store of information. This is not something that can hold huge amounts of information, but we can start juggling around with thoughts and ideas at this point. So it's feeding in those features and patterns, and we start to identify objects in that. So suppose that roughly the information that flowed into my visual working memory was this head. Now my visual working memory starts to sort of rough in the rest. So it's going, okay, well, I think that might be a dog. Well, that's roughly the shape of a dog. That's what I'd expect. It's why we get very surprised and you do that sort of double take when you suddenly realize a dog has 3 legs rather than 4. It's because you were anticipating it having 4, and then suddenly, once you put a bit more effort into it, you realize that might not be the case. So it starts to identify the object visually, but it also starts to pull in more conceptual information. So it's thinking it's a dog. Dogs are loyal and friendly. They're usually pets. They're usually furry. So it's starting to build up quite a rich interpretation. But it goes further than that because it's quite individualistic at this point. So this was my dog, may he rest in peace, called Barney. So because he's called Barney, I'd start to think about purple dinosaurs. So when I see that head, I start to think about purple dinosaurs. Probably you guys don't. But therefore, I'm slightly primed towards that purple dinosaur. If you don't know who Barney the purple dinosaur is, then speak to me afterwards and I will show you children's TV programs because I know too many of them. Anyway, this rich picture that's getting built up here is actually a collaboration between our visual working memory and our long-term memory, where long-term memory is this sort of more permanent store of insight information. And visual working memory and long-term memory are kind of working in tandem to try and load information into the visual working memory so that it can start to manipulate that and play around with it. Now, I've described this in really crude terms. This is all fairly abstract. We can't map this that readily onto the actual brain itself, which is why I haven't got the usual brain picture with areas highlighted in it, although we're starting to get to the bottom of some of this. Also, what I've described is only one of the many flows of sight in there. So what I described was bottom-up processing. So that's pure sort of reaction to the light hitting our eyes and going into our memory and reacting to what's going on there. The top-down processing influences things the other way. So it starts to sort of, tell visual working memory that maybe it should start looking for this dog shape. It starts to tweak the iconic memory to look for particular features and patterns and colors. So using top-down processing, that's why if I'm looking for a friend in a crowd who's tall and ginger, like tall people's heads that are sticking out above the crowd are going to jump out at me, and orange things are going to jump out at me. Because long-term memory and visual working memory are starting to prime the iconic memory back down that way. Like I said, this is a fairly crude description, but it hopefully gets you an idea of how our mechanism of sight starts to work. And hopefully as you went through that, I'll roll back a second. The reason we need top-down and bottom-up is because it helps us deal with ambiguities. So this is something I stumbled across when my math teacher started to accuse me of having bad handwriting, because I used that symbol in the middle and she couldn't tell if it was a B or a 13. It's particularly awkward when you lay it out like this. But top-down processing and bottom-up processing are sort of fighting each other here for context and all sorts of things. Lots of visual memory tricks and sight tricks are based on playing top-down and bottom-up processing off against each other. So where I was going to was that hopefully in all of that you spotted roughly where these rough ideas of System 1 and System 2 start to slot into the way we see things. So System 1 is this bit where we're just looking for patterns and shapes and putting very rough ideas into it. System 2 is where we're starting to do the mental agility part and starting to bring in more contextual information. So if you're still with me at this point and still in somewhat agreement, then I can start to talk about, okay, if we're doing data visualization well, we should be focusing on this bit at the front. And here, a lot of the the design kit you've got available to you are characterized as this in this term pre-attentive attributes, which is brilliantly self-descriptive because it's the attributes you notice before you attend to them, apparently. So these are the things, if we design for this brilliantly, then we'll just magically understand what's going on, for some definition of magic. Before going into the details of what that means in practice, I want to give you an example of how powerful this is once you start to use it as a conscious design tool. So here's a bunch of numbers. How many 4s are there in there? Anyone?
10, 4.
Good guess. Good guess. Good guess. But we're guessing, or we're trying to count. You know, everyone's having to work quite hard. There we go. You see? Good. System 2 is having to kick into overdrive to support that task. Now, as a designer, if I know that the task I'm building for is that question I just asked you, well, if I tweak ever so slightly the pre-attentive attribute of saturation on the colors, now I've designed for that task. So how many 4s are there?
5.
There you go. Okay, so well done for actually working out. Now, I could lie, right? If I didn't highlight one of those, a 4 that's in there, and I haven't, I've been honest this time, still most people would give the answer 5, because I've supported system 1 in getting an answer for me there, rather than forcing you to use system 2 and having to do all that deep processing. Again, this is how you cheat and lie, and there's some fantastic examples of visualizations that use that to their extreme. An Inconvenient Truth by Al Gore. Interesting presentation. Look at his charts, and he does a lot of lying in them by some of these kind of design tricks, let's say. So, anyway, here we go. Let's get a Java update. That's what everyone wants. Awesome. Nothing like having a developer laptop to really screw you over. Yes. Right. So, if we're happy that these pre-attentive attributes are our design tool here, as I see it in data, there are 2 core aspects to try and get people to understand. One is the values, the actual quantitative raw values, the information that's in there. And the other, which is sometimes overlooked, is the relationships that exist within that data, because the relationships between those values is kind of key to telling a story. So what I'm going to walk through is how we can use pre-attentive attributes to, I guess, understand and design around values, and again, how we do that for relationships separately, and then we'll see how we combine them. So, perceiving values. Now, here are a bunch of pre-attentive attributes. There are more, but I've picked these ones for a very specific reason. Now, hopefully you agree with all of these that in each of the examples you can see one that's different. So pre-attentive attributes are good for seeing difference. So orientation, there's one that's a bit squiffy, there's one that's a dot in the shape. I'm just getting romantic. We've got one that's bigger, and we've got one with a different color, one with a different color intensity. Now, all of these encode different, but values are not conveyed by understanding difference. They're conveyed by being able to kind of say more or less, having some relative notion in there. Now, only some of these pre-attentive attributes give us a natural understanding of more or less. So the size of a dot, the bigger dot, is naturally perceived as more or greater than. The line length, a shorter line, is perceived as less than. A thicker line is seen as more. The desaturated, the color intensity being lowered, is perceived as less. Surprisingly to me, actually, 2D location, even across cultures, allegedly, up and to the right is perceived as more, even for those the cultures where they write right to left or other orientations. So suddenly we can encode values and put some more or less kind of perception in there. But what's interesting about some of these pre-attentive attributes is some of them are quite accurate and some of them are really vague. So this thick line, how much thicker is it than the rest? How much more is it than the rest? Twice? 3 times, 4 times, something like that, maybe. The bigger size dots, again, something like that. Compare that to the line length, though, where most people very quickly would say it's about 3/4-ish. That's a really precise reading of something that's really just an abstract shape. Now, that's actually because the 2 pre-attentive attributes of line length and 2D location have a very accurate perception of greater and less than. And you have to take my word for that, or we can run to some other research that's been done. So this is actually back in 1984 and 1985, two guys called Cleveland and McGill did a whole bunch of research getting different people to compare how easy it is to compare values using different mechanisms, different visual representations of that data. Now, Alberto Cairo conveniently put this on a nice visualization for us, which they never did. But according to their measurements, everything, all the ways of encoding values at the top of that scale allow for more accurate judgments. And everything down the bottom allows for more generic judgments, which kind of aligns with what we just saw. Now, this, rather than what I just showed you, is a really useful tool because now we've got a way of evaluating visualizations and their efficacy. So I'll start with my favorite visualization, the pie chart. Now, pie charts encode their values using angle with a side effect of encoding it as area. So that's sort of middle to low end of our scale. So which one's more, the blue wedge or the red wedge? Look at those system twos running away, guesses coming in there, no real confidence. What if I took a visualization that sits right at the top of that scale? Same data, bar chart. Blue or red, as it was, right? No one has to guess here. Suddenly, it's just jumping out at you. So that's what we're talking about when it's more and less accurate. That can be a very powerful tool to understand a visualization. Now, I have to emphasize this. Up on the scale's not better. Down the scale's not worse. It's just about that accuracy. Now, sometimes you don't want something to be that accurate in how it conveys the information. We go back to that pie chart. If this is some, let's say, medical research that's results, and they've got the usual confidence interval type of measurement that's in there, if that one's, let's say, 24% and this one's 26%, and the confidence interval there's a confidence interval about 95% on it, then actually that's a good thing that we can't quite distinguish between those two things. So you might not want to say to someone, actually, here's the results of a research paper, and because everyone will say, well, this one's clearly better than that one, which might be an incorrect communication of the data. So hence trying to emphasize that this is not better and worse, it's just accuracy and something more vague. But once you get to grips with this tool, you can start to deconstruct more complex visualization. So this is something, it's a combination of a tree map and a heat map that are going on here. And the sort of the layout and the sizes of those rectangles is the tree map structure. And what we're seeing is the FTSE 100 probably 4 or 5 years ago when I took this screenshot. And the size of each rectangle, each is a stock, and the size of the rectangle is the market capitalization of that stock. So roughly speaking, how significant is that in this particular index? The green to red then is the heat map part, and that's encoding the price dropping, or the price drop versus the price raise. So really intense green for a good price hike, intense red for a price drop. Now, the encoding of that market capitalization is area. The encoding of the heat map, the price change, is color intensity. So both of these are actually quite low down on this scale, and therefore, naively, you might say not that useful. Well, actually, this kind of visualization is used quite heavily in financial services because it allows us to see a huge amount of information very quickly. It doesn't give us answers, but it gives us a starting point where I can be like, okay, right, so that red rectangle there, which company is that? What's going on there? That green one, what's going on there? But I can see that in the context of this whole market. So that's how you can start to deconstruct these things and understand their strengths and weaknesses. So that's perceiving values, right? Said we'd go, oh, no, it's not all perceiving values. See, must remember these things. I have to put this little note on here. Everything I've talked about with perceiving values is abstract shapes. It's abstract notions of value. To put the actual numbers in there, you need scales. You need to be able to quantify that. Now, unfortunately, the moment you get into numbers and things you have to read, that is system 2. You will immediately slow people down. It's a secondary, tertiary thing that people will go and explore. If a visualization is not clear, they start running towards those numbers. If you encode really nicely, as we have in some of those other examples I showed you, then the actual numbers start to become less useful, and it's more about a sort of navigational tool through the information and let me get down into that nitty-gritty like I showed you in the story at the very beginning. I don't think anyone was actually reading the scale off the side. They were just looking at the shape to begin with. So that's enough about values. Now we'll move on to relationships. So I'm going to talk about something called the Gestalt principles here, and hopefully many of the designers have come across Gestalt principles before, but may not have thought about them in the context of data visualization. For those who haven't, this was a school of psychology just over 100 years ago now, who identified these principles that said, identify how we perceive things as grouped, effectively, and we naturally see these things. So I'm going to go through a number of the Gestalt principles. There's more than I'm going to touch on, but I'll show you how they become a tool, a conscious tool, despite being patently obvious when you explain it. So the first Gestalt principle I'm going to talk about is that of similarity, and that says that things that look the same are perceived to be part of a group. So the filled circles look like they're part of a group, and the empty circles look like they're part of a group. The big ones versus the small ones, the slanty ovals versus the flat ovals, and there's three groups going on here. Hopefully you see that. But this can become a conscious tool. So when I do a scatter plot like this, again, apologies to those with color blindness issues, those without color blindness issues will see three colors in here, and will recognize that as three series of information, three groups of information. If you imagine that without the colors applied, it's just a sort of random splodge of dots. But by highlighting and understanding the series that are in there, which is like an obvious normal thing we would do, suddenly you start to see some shapes. So there's the blue group down here, and the orange in the middle, and the green at the top. So suddenly we can perceive relationships in that information. Next principle I'm going to touch on, that of proximity, which says that things that are closer together look like they belong together. Fairly obvious when you point it out. I used it already because I created 4 groups with subgroups by combining these two principles together. But you can use it quite subtly as well. So here's abstractly the same data, but on the left for you guys, you see columns, and on the other side you see rows. And it's only a handful of pixels difference there, but I have suddenly, with my pre-attentive magic, controlled how you read that information. Really quite significantly, just with these small adjustments. Right, another Gestalt principle, that of enclosure. If we draw a bounding box or some background to an area, those objects are perceived as being a group. So we have a group here, we have a group here, and we've got a bunch of them that's in the middle. Again, this is a really obvious, natural tool to use. We get to use it in things like Venn diagrams. And if anyone can find me a keytar-playing duckbill platypus, I will buy it off you. I will buy it off you. But here again, you've seen the kind of groups and relationships sitting there. It's really obvious when you start to point this out. Now the next one, Gestalt principle, is that of connection. So things that are connected by a line are perceived as a group. Now I've got kind of starting to play with Gestalt principles here, because if you can ignore the connecting line for a second, that's the one we saw before that you see as columns, but I've now drawn a connecting line and suddenly you read them as rows again. Now, I haven't found any hard evidence which suggests that certain Gestalt principles trump others, but anecdotally, from my experience, the order I presented them in is the order that they start to trump each other on. So connection, the strongest connection will trump enclosure, which will trump proximity, which will trump similarity. So you can start to create quite sophisticated notions of groups in there. Connection, sorry, I have to hang my head in shame because I'm totally not up to date with Game of Thrones, gives you things like family trees, and you see a relationship in there. And I have no doubt that most of these people are dead by now, but don't spoil it for me. Right, so that's a really important part of perceiving relationships. But there's one other thing that's often overlooked. That's the tool of ordering, sorting things in a particular order. I'm just going to give you an example of this to bring this to life. So I showed you this visualization right at the beginning. These are the order of the things I'm going to talk about and for how long. That's one story. Here's a different sorting to that same information. Now the story is, which one am I going to babble on about for the longest? Same data, same information, arguably same visualization. All I've done is tweak the order, and suddenly it's a completely different story that I'm telling with that. So if you know your audience and you know what you're trying to convey, or what you're trying to help them understand, you can use these tools in all sorts of powerful ways that aren't always that obvious unless you start thinking about them. So that's the sort of picture in the round, right? We thought about trying to understand this notion of system 1 and system 2 and how that fits into how we perceive things, and then that gives us the notion of pre-attentive attributes and how we can tweak those and use those to best convey values and relationships. And I want to show you when this gets into, when you can actively use this for something quite powerful. So this is a visualization from the New York Times back in 2010. And so far, so scatterplot. So on the horizontal axis, we've got the miles driven per capita in the States. On the vertical axis, we've got the price of a gallon of gasoline, which is some amount of liters of petrol for those of you who don't speak American. And each of these dots represents a year. And it's really hard to see anything much in there other than a scatter of years. Now what Hannah Fairfield did, this is the first time I'm aware of this technique being used, is she introduced the Gestalt principle of connection to draw this connecting line that is time. Suddenly you start to see where she got the title from. So suddenly you're starting to see that here in the late noughties into 2010, as the price of petrol rocketed, people started driving less. And suddenly she found her story right there, hiding in front of her. And all she did was throw in one extra Gestalt principle, which you don't commonly see on scatter plots. It's quite interesting. Now we, here at Scott Logic, use this a lot in all sorts of different systems that we've developed. So, sometimes you're making a system which is pretty much just a giant chart or a number of charts. Sometimes, though, you're using this in little tools, little visualizations that you scatter around something more complicated to help people quickly get a feel for what's going on, in this case, in the energy market, when they're buying and selling electricity. Sometimes it's, I'll say, our more traditional dashboards where we get to throw a whole variety of charts in there as well. But each and every one of these shouldn't just be done lazily by picking the obvious chart types or whatever it is you get out of the box in your charting library. You should start to think about designing for some of these small little details and really controlling how people interpret the information that's there. So hopefully that all starts to make a lot of sense and be quite useful for you. I'm not preaching beyond this, let's just laying that out there. Now I know I've thrown an awful lot at you there. There's references to all sorts of books on a lot of the diagrams. Rather than going through all of that, the slides are here on that GitHub URL. I'll stick it on Twitter this evening as well, and you can go and find it all out there. The link underneath, as of I think last week, has been killed because someone bought out Creative Block. The article is there. I'll find the actual URL and post that for all of you. This was a sister article I wrote, which is a condensed version of what I've just shouted at you about for half an hour. So thank you very much for that. Are we doing questions? Questions. Anyone got any questions? Like, why did the lights go off? Which I'll go and solve after this.
You said that you didn't want to go down a particular path, saying one is better than the other. Do you have any personal favourites, like ways of presenting data that you think it's more persuasive?
No. It's very context dependent. Although most of the people at Scott Logic know that if I have to look at 3D pie charts, that just is like kryptonite to me because they are rubbish. They're unequivocally rubbish. If people really want to annoy me, they make pie charts that have exploding wedges when you click on them and spin round, and it makes me cringe. They're very, very glitzy. They're very they look beautiful, but they're not very functional. And I think where my natural instinct is towards function over form rather than form over function. So I tend towards things higher up that scale. But there are fantastic visualization experts out there. There's people like Giorgia Lupi, an Accurate Studio that she originally founded, who do things that are much more, I guess they're tipping into a more artistic realm. And that's beautiful stuff. It's just not what comes to me naturally, in part because I work on very functional systems, not on systems that need to just attract the masses. So it's very context dependent. Any other questions?
And I thought it's quite interesting that you link the book to the method that you talked about from System 1 and System 2. I got a question on the data visualization when people perceiving it. So in UX, we do like evaluation to see whether your solution is being perceived well. Mm-hmm. But how do you do it in data visualization?
Well, and thereby you've stumbled on a fairly hot debate that's going on in the data visualization community. I mean, the reality is that there are, in most visualizations, there are so many variables and factors to take into account. It is now impossible to do proper blind or double-blind evaluations of these things. The reason I present this information the way I do is it gives you a starting point to probably design something that's decent. Now, I would still explore, say, more drastic variations of different visualization techniques, but I think you'd really struggle to get most people to see any real difference in subtle tweaks on how you've done a bar chart or subtle tweaks on how you've done a pie chart. There's still a degree of, I'll say, data visualization illiteracy. That means that we're not at a stage where we can really truly evaluate people around this stuff and their understanding. Mostly because I guess they don't necessarily remember the right thing. And I'm specifically, there was a hot debate a few years ago about the notion of chart junk. So whether or not you should have charts that have extra shiny things added. So the particular example was, there's a bar chart where it was a monster and it was the teeth of the monster was the bars, and there was another one where it was a line chart and it had an attractive lady and her leg was the line chart. And they compared that to, I'll say, raw visualizations of that same data and did tests of which do you immediately understand better and then which do you remember in months, weeks, years to come. People remember the slightly over-the-top cartoonish ones, but they don't remember the message in there. I mean, you literally could have just written the headline and had the picture, and that's what they remembered. They didn't remember the data. So it's hard to always understand exactly what you're evaluating for, and then how do you pose questions and criteria to understand if people are communicating their understanding back to you. There is loads of literature out there, and everyone disagrees with each other on this at the moment. So there is no easy answer. I wouldn't worry about it too much beyond, yes, in the way I use it as a UX designer is understanding the purpose of the tool. Is it something that it's more about analysis and something people are going to be staring at and spending time with, or is it about sort of attracting interest and more consumer focused, and that would tip me into very different directions. Typically, the more analytical piece further up that scale I showed you in the perceiving values, and the more graphically pretty stuff further down the scale. And that's the trade-offs you have to make. That's where the designer has to come in, and the researcher side of you has to take a bit of a back seat, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Right.
Oh, good.
Thanks very much.
Again.
Yep.
Nice shot.
That's great. That was really insightful for data visualization. I actually work with McKinsey, oil and gas data analysis.
Yeah.
Going into a whole industry where you're working with a big enterprise client and dealing with that amount of data, that becomes really relevant and helpful. Also makes me think it's something I'm going to talk to you all about after the last talk was the State of Scotland's UX report. Hands up who added to that survey last year when we pushed it out. Yeah, it showed in the data. So obviously, I just elongated the data and link up. There was about 100 responses, I think, and I was trying to figure out a way to get more responses, and I don't know if it's wording or whatnot, or people are worried about where the data is going. But I'll touch on that at the end of it, because data is really important, especially for an industry like ours that's rapidly growing and has been the past decade. So like I say, I'll touch on that at the end, but I'll introduce Michael Higney just now, who's probably got you questioning the relationship between UX and Agile.
Why would you think that?
Oh, not at all. All right, cool. Right, well,
Why would we
thank
do
you,
that?
Michael.
Thank you very much, Marty. Thanks. I think it's really important that the UX community is facilitated, and Marty and Mike Jefferson are two of the people that are really, championing that in Edinburgh. So I'm really, really grateful to him for doing that in the first place, but also for allowing me to speak here. Also to Scott Logic for hosting us, and that was an amazing topic there. There's so much that I'll take away from that. I'm sure everyone feels the same way. And finally, thanks to Alan and Product Forge for coming here, and to whoever's watching right now on the live stream.
Do we have numbers actually?
Yeah, lots. So that's good. The presentation I'm about to give is sort of aimed more at particularly organizations and teams where they're getting frustrated with Agile for some reason. I wonder what they could be. You know, and it's a lot based on the work that I've done over the last 6 years. I've been contracting sometimes as a project manager, sometimes as a Scrum Master, sometimes as a product owner, sometimes as a UX lead. And what I've found is there's a lot of this is based on the organizations I've been in, where they've been trying to implement a massive digital transformation and change program, and they've been trying to do that digital transformation and change using Agile, whatever that means. And so there's a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek look at, you know, what the successes have been and what the failures have been. In my experience, a lot of these projects haven't been as successful as they want. Certainly not as successful in implementing a long-term Agile strategy. They maybe delivered something and got it over the line, but they maybe didn't have the opportunity to then continue to iterate on that. Certainly, I don't think the teams that they put so much time and effort and money into building still exist. And I think if that's not the case, if that isn't the case, that people want to continue to work together, then has the project really been a success? You know, people can say it's a success if they meet some goals. Recently, I had a problem with my online banking. It gave me a warning message to say this would be your last attempt, because there are at least 5 different security attributes it has. It has a user ID and a online phone ID and a memorable word, and so all these things. And before it logged me out, I noted this and I said, and so I didn't enter another. I was trying to change a standing order. Imagine that, trying to change the value of a standing order on an app that I'd already used 2 forms of authentication to do that, and still it wanted another one. And so then I logged out, tried to do it on my laptop, thought, oh, I need the user ID, logged out to try and get it, and then it wouldn't log me in. So anyway, the point I'm making is like that, if that's what they think is working, you know, clearly that doesn't happen very often, but obviously on the surface it kind of looks like the system's working, but I don't think it is. So the title's there. So I hope this is useful for you guys, because, you know, you are more UX professionals, I hope, and, you know, maybe you are working in places where this hasn't been the case. I hope so. But also I hope that it's sort of a testing ground for me to say, you know, some of these hypotheses, are they true, or, you know, is this just my experience? So I'd like to hear from you afterwards about whether you think it's accurate or not. So a little bit about myself. Yeah, I've been working in digital since I started, which is back since 1998, and I've worked with different organisations from Marks and Spencers to Scottish Government. I've worked with startups, and I recently worked with a company in Darlington, and where I was the UX lead. I've worked in companies where they have been advertising for UXers, UX people, and when you get there, they actually just want someone to design their UIs. So it's actually a UI role. But that's fine, you know, that's good up to a point. But I guess what I'm saying is, you know, I think there's a lot that we can take away and learn. And, you know, I'm Scrum certified, I'm Prince 2 certified, and I'm UX certified as well, thanks to User Vision. So, you know, I have a good base in both groundings. The other thing that I would say is, when I started out, I worked with a company in the Netherlands, and I led the digital strategy there, and we delivered something like I was providing services to 20 countries in 14 languages, intranet, extranet, email market, and all these things. And we did it with a very, very small team. At the time, I didn't recognize it as an agile way of doing things, but it certainly was. Equally, all of these websites had to have their UIs and think about the user experience to conversion rate optimize. And again, this wasn't part of my lexicon at the time, but it was certainly things that we were doing. Now these are specialist areas, and one of the big questions that I'll maybe be asking is what's happened to the cross-functional, multidisciplinary team that we wanted in Agile, and what can we do about that as well. So that's a little bit about me. I've worked with everything from startups to large organizations, and so what have I learned from that? What's important to me? I think rather than talk about the places that I've worked, or just talk about the places that I've worked and the problems, I want to say what have I taken away personally from all of these experiences. And I think the one thing that I always revert back to in life, no matter what I'm doing, whether it's career, whether it's my personal life, whether it's whatever goals I'm setting, I think, where am I on Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Am I ensuring that my basic needs are met? Can I ensure that, because if you can't do that, you're not going to reach, I think contentment's a good way of putting it, that you're not happy, content in the job you're doing, content in the house that you're living in, content with the things, the relationships that you have. When I had my startup, I put myself in a precarious position that left me with very little. So it was useful to have something to refer to say, to rebuild that and re-establish yourself. So this led me really, Maslow's hierarchy really, those lines about, creating community. So when I came to live in Edinburgh, so I'd been living in different places. I'd been in Dubai, and I'd been in the Netherlands. I've been in Preston even, if anyone's heard of Preston. So yeah, I'd been all over, and I was like, well, where would I want to base myself, and where would I like to start to really build these on Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Because, if you don't base yourself in one place, you're not going to build the community you want. So I went to a lot of meetup groups, and which is there's lots of them in Edinburgh, and built a lot of relationships, because I've seen that was really, really important to achieving my long-term aspirations and goals. Also, because I was moving around a lot, partly by default, I became a bit of a minimalist. It wasn't so much fun dragging this stuff around with you, and you start to really learn what you really need and what you don't need. And then, I've read about it, and there's a good movie out there on Netflix. I think this is really important. It's about putting value into things that are important and not worrying about things aren't. I don't do a lot of shopping. That's one thing that I don't spend a lot of time on. I don't have a lot of belongings in my house. I don't have a flat screen TV. I have a projector that I picked up for £15 in the Remakery. I don't know if you know the Remakery in Leith, yeah. So there's things like this too, and I really enjoy going to the Remakery, or I enjoy the tool library in Leith. So instead of hiring tools, why do we need all these tools? We can do these things. So there's a lot of, the world today is a lot more people are coming around to this idea of putting value on the things that are important. And that leads to this is sort of more at the early stages of this, sort of trying to think a little bit more about slow living at a pace that you're comfortable with. Everybody's different. It's not about winning, it's not about, we're not all marathon runners, or we're not all sprinters, we're all different. It's not about comparing ourselves to other people. It's about, knowing where you are in the race that you want to live in. So an example of this is, in between contracts, I often take a bit of a break. I'm like, there's not really that much hurry for me to start working again. I don't have any family, so I don't have any dependents, so they're not, going hungry or anything as a result. But I kind of think, when you've worked quite hard on something for 3 months or 4 months, you need a little bit of time off. And there's a good example of this today on LinkedIn. I saw a lady who had posted saying she'd had an injury, she'd had an operation, and what should she fill in on her CV to explain this? Because she was worried that employers would look negatively at that. And I thought, that's a shame that people think that they need to do that in the first place. And it's a shame that employers, you do get this a lot from recruitment, saying, oh, you can't have any gaps. I think it's fine to have gaps. In fact, I would think that someone who's had taken the time between contracts or between roles is actually better positioned to come in and give their best. So I think these are important concepts, and again, things that hopefully I'm trying to emulate in trying to promote. Now, the other thing is that when I am between contracts, I do other things. So one thing that I did was, last year I created an event called Art on the Street on Thistle Street. That took quite a lot of my time and energy. I did that in a sort of agile way. I did it as a sort of an experiment to see how it went. And the other thing that I've been working on recently, I've been working on a thing called UXTV. So UXTV is about connecting with people, discussing customer experience, discussing user experience, and sharing that with a wider audience, and hopefully helping to contribute to the community as a whole. I also think that everything's converging on UX as well. So having been a project manager and product owner, I kind of feel like UX is sort of my road to Damascus moment when I realized actually I'm those things, but I'm more of a UX professional than I am those things. As I said, I think a lot of things are starting to converge there, because if you're not getting it right for the user, your systems aren't going to be used for very long. And there are people sort of skating over that, but I think that isn't a sustainable position to be in. What I want to avoid is UX becoming like this, that it's another buzzword. But I definitely feel that through my experience over the last 20 years, and that UX for a large part didn't exist at the start. Agile didn't exist. Now you're starting to see maybe 5-6 years ago, Agile started to become a big thing that everybody started doing. I think is that fair to say? And everyone was now, we've got to be digital transformation change, we've got to be Agile. I think, and this goes to the title, I think people are going to start to look to be more UX. How can they improve their UX? What are they doing to do that? So I think that's important. But what we want to avoid is that it just becomes another buzzword and loses all its meaning. Because I think Agile actually has done, that's happened to Agile a lot, is now when you say it, people sort of turn their eyes and they don't want to hear about it. So that's to this point. I think what's happened with Agile is that there's been a lot of broken promises from it. It promised that it would deliver so much with so few people in such a fast pace of time, and that hasn't happened. I think part of why that hasn't happened and why companies haven't evolved to make that happen is that they've made some mistakes. And one of the big mistakes is they haven't learned from the mistakes that have been going on. They've sort of brushed them under the carpet and said, it's okay, we'll just keep doing Agile the way we've been doing it. I think another part of that is it's been very much led by the technical side of things. But also, like I've seen projects where we've been creating assets on giving people PDFs of how to use the system. So it's like, well, if we're doing that, we're probably in the wrong place, Also, I think the user engagement gets pushed back and pushed back and pushed back until it maybe doesn't happen at all. So where at the start, they were keen to involve the user, we'll get them in and we'll show them stuff that we're working on. That doesn't happen. Oh, we can't show them this time. At the end of next sprint, it never happens. Similarly, the stakeholder engagement, their expectations aren't managed. Certainly, one of the last projects I was on, they hadn't seen anything for so long, and then they're like banging on the door. Look, we got to see something now, whatever it is, and then their expectations aren't always met. And a large part, deadlines are being missed, milestones are being missed. There's delays. There's the inevitable cost that brings to things. And also this thing about, are teams really cross-functional? Is there really a good balance in the teams? Are they quite leaning towards the technical side? And even within that, are the technical people willing to be multidisciplinary? And then to even basic things like, how long is a sprint? Because it seems to be 2 weeks, right? Everywhere. But it doesn't say anywhere that a sprint has to be 2 weeks, does it? So in a system that was supposed to remove accepted norms, we now have accepted norms. And the funny thing, that's the sort of bugbear for me, because often in the organization, the existing governance is maybe monthly, yet they're trying to do demos every 2 weeks. And it's hard enough to get some of the senior stakeholders to come to a demo in the first place without forcing them to come to 2, and then them saying, I'm just not going to go to them at all because there wasn't anything of value there. So, I think these are some of the lessons, or certainly some of the things that I've seen in certain organizations that have been commonplace, and sort of the question is, what do we do about it? Now, the good news is that there are success stories out there, and I'm going to tell you about one of those success stories. I sort of hinted at it there already. And it's actually, I think the other thing that I want to emphasize here is that trying to see Agile and UX not in a technical way, but trying to see these things in a more holistic way, or a more physical way. So this is a success story. This is one of the best success stories in all my time that I've ever seen. And this is a guy called Chami who lives in Sri Lanka. And Chami survived the tsunami there. And a few months afterwards, a lady from Ireland gave him $500. And with that, he bought a tuk-tuk. And with that tuk-tuk, he got to know the tourists, and he would take them as far as the tuk-tuk would take them. And he saved the money, and then he bought a van, And with the van, he took them further, and he saved that money. Eventually got married. He bought he got a bit of land, and he built 2 rooms. And then 6 months later, he built another room. And he built these things, and he built the relationships with the people there, and he created pretty much somewhere between a hostel, bed and breakfast, and hotel, where I think he's got like 20 rooms there now. The house that he lives on the ground floor, and the people above him are a British couple who helped build a cabana resort as well. I think there's 6 cabanas in this resort. And so they live on the next floor, and the top floor is a Dutch guy who visits once a year. And I guess they probably paid for his house, but it means that he is the real epitome, the personification of Agile for me. I spent 2 months in Sri Lanka living in the Dutch guy's house because he wasn't there, and Chami was able to rent that out when he was there. So I guess what I'm saying is, like Agile and the inspiration for Agile and seeing things that work doesn't have to just come from people who've been working on the technical side or been doing extreme programming or something like that. I think we need to take inspiration from people like Chami, because this is really showing that with very, very little, you can achieve a lot. You can build and you can iterate and you can continue to do that. And then you can have things like this where, these people in the picture, these people do all kinds of things. Like this is a cook, but they're also, taking people on tours, translating for them, letting them know where to go to find whatever they need. Whatever it is that they're adaptive, they change what they need to do. In fact, this guy who they just referred to sort of as in their language, this was like Papa or Daddy or whatever, this is all they would call him. And I thought, well, this guy, like he was around all the time. He was doing security, he'd be there all night. And, I kind of was curious about, thinking, oh, this guy's maybe, had a, he doesn't have any family or anything. He seems to be here all the time. He's just an old guy. I didn't really read him right, but was lucky enough towards the end to actually go and meet one of his sons had a daughter, and they were having like a sort of like a bar mitzvah type thing. Although she was only about 8, but whatever the tradition in their area was, it was kind of like a recognition of a milestone in their lives. So they had a big party, and they invited everyone from all around. And the thing was that he'd worked for the government all his life, but in his retirement, he'd got to know Chami, and he'd wanted to work with him and help him. So again, for me, this is a really good example of sort of the cross-functional, multidisciplinary teams that we're sort of aspiring for, we were promised in Agile. So dealing with some of these issues that I mentioned earlier, this is my favorite slide of all at the moment. It's like, I think it's really important, and it really helps to illustrate to non-UX people what they should be aiming for. So whenever they go off piste, you can bring them back to this. But it's that idea that if you have to explain it, it's not very good. And then some of the other things that I'm trying to help deal with here are some of the things I think we can do that we need to focus on is engagement. So I think projects need to go from being sort of Agile-led or Scrum-led or jumping into fixing the problem to a little bit more engagement-led. And what I mean by that is, in a lot of cases, the stakeholders don't get to see anything because they go, oh, we know what we want, we gather your requirements, we put those into some sort of stories, and we will start delivering, and we'll show you something in a few weeks or a few months or whatever. And sometimes that doesn't happen. Whereas I think if we were to have a more engagement-led approach, where we were able to show them UI designs earlier on, prototypes earlier on, and maybe coded features with some inputs and outputs, we would get a chance for the team, particularly I'm thinking of the back-end developers and those types of people, to be involved in that process. Maybe they don't need to be there all the time, but that they could at least be part of that team that helps structure it, maybe sit with the designers and the prototypers to see what they're doing and understand and contribute. But hopefully we would come out with, rather than documents to explain the user requirements, some visual, much more developed visual assets that they can then hand over to front-end, back-end developers to then build. And certainly that was the case in some of the projects that I've been in. And also, I don't like this idea, people really struggle with MVP and what to build first. And I see in too many projects that they have to build everything that was already there just on a new platform or a new UI, or, they're changing over. And I think that's a mistake, because a lot of the times they're going to compare what they've had with what you're trying to provide to them. And they'll always be critical of that, even if it's brilliant. Also, it's very hard, because where do you have the cutoff point? And then we get into a situation where Agile was meant to deliver fully releasable products, but you can't do that if there's an expectation to deliver a minimum feature list, which can be quite long and constantly growing and never gets signed off. So I think, again, by visualizing this stuff, we can actually hopefully deal with some of the bigger problems. And the reason I give the Apple as an example is no one really cares that it had a new camera. It's only when you do something markedly different that they start to see this. I was on an app recently where I went to log in, and the first thing that came up was, we've stopped using this app anymore. We need you to download another one. This was a big issue for some people that I worked with, where they're like, oh, we've got to update the app, and we can't release the new one until we've everything updated, and we'll just update it all in one go. It doesn't really work. So we've got to think about that. How do we, really look at what features do we need to deliver? I think another thing, and I've put this into two parts, is looking at the team and how the team's structured in these organizations. My general experience has been that they are hiring everyone in one go. They want everyone to start in the team immediately, and they want them all to start sprinting immediately and start building stuff. And I'm not sure that's the best approach either. I think we need to build our teams out instead of starting off with everyone there from day one. And certainly, and also to make sure that the UX is part of those teams that lead. Maybe we need to restructure Scrum to include a UX lead alongside the Scrum Master, where if the product owner is going to be the subject matter expert or the internal person, because I think that's probably a good idea. But generally, those product owners aren't fully equipped to be product owners in that sense. So they need that support from the Scrum Master. And then if that's too technical, then they end up having a technical project instead of a UX one, or a balanced one. So I think it's important that people start to think about building out the team rather than just throwing people together. In one project I was at for a very large organization, they hired 500 people because they got the CapEx to do it. And there's like, right, we need these 500 people, and they're all going to start on Monday for us to meet the deadlines that we're going to commit to, because that's what they'd agreed in CapEx. We need 500 people, and we need 3 years to deliver this, and that's to do. But the reality is they're not going to have 500 people on day one. It's probably going to take them 6 months or a year. So immediately they're behind the schedule of what they're trying to achieve. So that just doesn't work. And also, these teams are not as balanced as they could be. Again, in my experience, they tend to be very technically driven. A lot of developers, front end, back end. Testers are there, UX is there, but it's not necessarily got an equal voice at the very least, and it tends to be too slanted. And because there's a majority of them, that's what rules. When it gets to a situation where you're having to make decisions, I remember when we're scoring stories, when we're trying to predict the length of stories, everyone's meant to have an equal voice, and in those voices, it's meant to be a fully testable, releasable item. But how many times can it be tested in the time they've got? Can it even be released? And again, I think this goes to them trying to run before they can really walk. If things had been prototyped, if a lot of the niggly things have been sorted out before they go to build it, they probably could build it just as quick in the same time. So I think there needs to be more balance in these teams. And again, this is designed hopefully to help with those conversations in the future. And again, the user engagement, I think often it's too late because they haven't got the visual aids, and they don't, people don't experiment. I think particularly developers who are very, very smart people, in my experience, they could learn how to use a wireframe tool, or they could cut stuff up with paper and cardboard. They're reluctant, I'll give it that, but then there's no emphasis from the management or the senior people to say, come on guys, let's actually give this a go. They just really want to stick to what they know. That's not multidisciplinary. That's not them, trying to understand. I'd like to see people more, when they talk about peer working, it's generally peer working of siloed skill sets. So peer working of UI designers, peer working of developers. Well, how often have you seen them working together for a full day just to understand what the other person does? I haven't seen it very often, so. And again, utilising the information, I think and I'm all for it, doing observations and usability testing, etc., to inform. But also, I think there's often a mistake that gets happened, which is a lot of this information is already there, sitting on a hard drive, on a SharePoint somewhere. One of the organisations I went into a few years ago, where I was supporting the product owner, they had a spreadsheet of customer complaints. And nobody else in the team had read it, and they sort of scoffed at me asking for it. But I was like, oh, no, I'd like to see that, what's in it? And they're, oh, it's 3,000, lines. Well, here you go, have it, there you go. And it was on the drive, so I took a look. But what we were able to do whenever you went through it is, actually, it wasn't that hard to go through, because what I was really looking for was where they'd taken the time, on an online form, remember, which is quite usually difficult to use, where they'd taken the time to write anything other than a few words. Because they were so frustrated that they'd actually taken the time to go, well, this didn't work, and why doesn't this? And I was like, this is gold dust. This is where we can really get an advantage. We already have a starting point to have those future discussions. And so going through those 2,000 or 3,000 lines, it was easy to find those ones that stood out and group them together, and then present that back to the product owner and the team and say, actually, we've already got a starting point. Now that could also inform how you bring people in and the questions you ask them. So I just think there's not enough, again, in my experience, there's not enough time spent looking at that. And it might even be going to a competitor's site and looking at their Twitter, or looking at their Facebook, and looking at the reviews and seeing what people have complained about them and what you can learn from that, if the organisation's not comfortable looking at itself, And there's also this new, I was down at Manchester with Mike a couple of weeks ago, and we were at Northern UX, NUX. And what I found really interesting was this idea of the research operations. Or I'm not sure if that's a term that's sticking yet. I kind of like UX operations, because I think it covers both angles, but we'll see how it evolves. And now these aren't my slides, these are Emma Bolton's, who was there, but it was just to give you an idea. I think this is really useful. I also think that, part of the community should be to support each other. So, hopefully going through these. So I'm going to jump through these, because these are all things that you know. And back to this question, whether it's Agile. See, I want to play a bit with this, because I want, particularly the people who are big Agile technical side, to question, and learn from this too, and ask the question, well, where does UX fit within Agile? And, this is an Agile, this is a UX workflow from the syllabus that I studied. And
set up a break just now, just for everyone to go to the toilet. You need to also just grab another drink, slice of pizza. We'll be back in like 5-10 minutes. Also, in this break and at the end of the talks overall, if any of you are keen to go in front of the camera with Alan at Product Forge, just you may just ask you kind of how do you find the event, kind of maybe what do you want to see at the events, that kind of thing. If you find that time, feel free to go over to him. Is that cool? Cool. But other than that, I'll give you 5-10 minutes, so just stretch your legs, that kind of thing. Cool.
thank you. Thanks for.
Are we good to go?
Right, so we've got our last talk here with Sam Dodds from Tab, and he's going to take us through one of the key projects that he was part of.
Text broken.
Yeah, pretty much, yeah.
And Graham?
I used the screen reader so I can
Okay, all right, yeah, that's a interesting use of it. Does anybody know of any other native accessibility features? Can anybody name any? Yeah. Yeah, and dynamic type is another, like, so just, there might even be people here that use different font sizes but didn't really think that that was an accessibility feature. I think we can all agree that we've come a long way from this icon here, which is a wheelchair. Yet, when I was looking on Noun Project the other day for an accessibility icon, still I found a load of wheelchairs. So my brain was thinking, like, what would actually make a better icon for accessibility? So it's not just about screen readers and increased font sizes and things like that. It's about making a simple user experience for everybody, which just means all-inclusive experience. So I was thinking, like, something like this might be a bit better because it says that you're including everybody. I quite like this icon, but it's actually important to distinguish between accessibility and inclusivity. So accessibility is all about, there's many concepts involved in it, but it's things like decreased vision. That might mean that you're completely blind, or you have difficulty perceiving colours, or mobility might not be able to walk, or you might have decreased dexterity. Auditory, you might be deaf, or you might be hard of hearing. So having a user experience that is just revolves around audio is obviously a big no-no. So let's say a user could use your entire app, but your onboarding experience is a video which requires them to listen to it, then it basically means that they can't use your app anymore. Even though once they had been onboarded, they might be able to use the rest of it unaided. And cognitive and neurological disabilities. So like this might be reduced attention span, reduced ability to interpret iconography. So just having icons without labels attached to them is a big no-no. It includes things like short-term memory loss or cognitive disability, like learning disabilities. So might not be able to remember what you were doing on a previous screen, so it's important to thread the message throughout a user experience. So yeah, inclusivity is about including people that don't have a specific disability or an additional need. It's just about including everybody. So maybe that thing about not being able to use audio applies to someone that's just out in public, or they're on the tube. They don't want everybody listening to what they're doing. So I think of inclusivity as kind of accessibility with a lowercase a, which is different to accessibility with an uppercase A, which is has a specific definition. Inclusivity more like accessibility, just enabling access for everybody. And I think kind of the number one rule in all of this is just to make it simple. And it comes back to what Michael was saying earlier. UI UX is like a joke. If you have to explain it, then it's no good. So it's the kind of same principle. You just make it simple. You don't have to explain anything. So there's a familiar example here. Hopefully some of you have used the Google Maps app and are familiar with the tap and drag zoom using a single finger. That's just making it simple. I don't actually know how I discovered this feature. It is discoverable, so it's not the most accessible because you have to discover it. But still, it kind of just felt intuitive to me. And actually now, if my phone's down here, I don't even have to hold my phone in order to fully interact with it and move around and use Zoom, which is I don't even have to use two fingers for. But today I could talk to you about accessibility concepts in great depth, but I thought it'd be really useful to kind of put a lens over it and talk in the context of a specific case study. So I've been working at Tab for almost 7 years, and for 2.5 of those I was working with Tesco on a number of different products, and one of those was the Tesco Groceries App. Has anybody used the Tesco Groceries App toward their online shopping? Yeah. Cool, good. You've used our app. Have you used it in the last year?
I used it 2 days ago.
Excellent.
It's actually quite good.
I knew I liked you. I knew I liked you, Gillis. Actually quite good. Great feedback. 5-star review. 5-star review. So I was the lead engineer across the mobile apps, and we focused heavily on accessibility. So that's the case study that I'm going to use here. Online shopping in its very nature is accessible because it enables people to get their groceries delivered to them when they might not be so easily able to get down to the shop, or they might be unwell and don't want to move and don't want to spread their germs around, or they might find themselves with significantly less time on their hands than they're used to.
Is that a real icon?
It's a great icon, isn't it? Iconography without a label attached to it, though, wouldn't make sense, would it? Or it could just be that you're hungover and you forgot to order your supplies for your Saturday morning fry-up. So it all started with Tesco back in 1984 when they pioneered home grocery shopping with Jane Snowball, who one of the Tesco buildings is now named after. Who she placed an order from the comfort of her armchair on something that looked a bit like this. So probably all of you are sort of cringing in your seats now looking at the design of this. But they made it simple, right? So Tesco, now 35 years later, still concentrating on making sure that they have an all-inclusive experience for everybody. And this person doesn't have a specific disability, but they're just recovering from major surgery, and now they've got a customer for life. So it's obviously, that's makes it important to Tesco. And like I said, it's just making it simple. So online grocery shopping in its very nature is accessible with a lowercase a, but not all experiences are accessible with an uppercase a. And we wanted to change that. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about our case study here. So iOS and Android have a load of native features built into the operating systems that we can leverage as designers and developers and people that make products for people to use. And so I'm going to talk about some from an iOS point of view. Voiceover is the screen reader, which enables you to navigate your phone only through touch, and it reads out to you what you're touching and what you're interacting with. Speak Screen enables you to read the entire contents of the screen. Speak Selection enables you to select a single label and read it out to you. So it might just be that your your vision is reduced and you're not quite sure what a label says, so you want to ask it to read it out. Switch control is for people with reduced mobility that are able to interact with their phones probably better than I can, just using a small device that has a very simple switch on it that they either control with their head or with their tongue or with like a single finger, and it enables them to navigate through the entire device and come into apps, come out of apps, and it's really cool to see. Dynamic type is probably the one that most people are familiar with, which is just the increased and decreased text sizes. Bold text is just what it says on the tin, so it's making bold text stand out a little bit more, and this is a native operating system feature, but third-party apps that we all build have to implement this separately. And reduced motion is for people that might have motion sickness or something like that and don't want or just get distracted by too many crazy animations. So the operating system can limit that. So what I recommend really focusing on is VoiceOver, the screen reader technology, and different text sizes. And that really is because you get a lot of this for free from doing the VoiceOver stuff, and also speaking what's on a label and being able to change the text on a label to bold. You get very cheaply on top of implementing dynamic text, because when you're thinking about dynamic text, you have to think about that your UI isn't going to look as you've beautifully designed it, and it's going to come down labels are going to break from 1 line to 2 lines, or from 2 lines to 3 lines, and bold text is the same. And because you have that ultimate control over all of your labels in your app, it means that adding support to allow people to speak the contents of that label out comes much more cheaply. But while we're focusing on these very specific features, it's also important to think about people that have needs that aren't aided by native settings. So colour blindness. This is something Graham mentioned quite a few times in his talk, because of showing graphs that relied on colour alone. But the previous slide that I was showing you, if I had relied on colour alone, some people might not have been able to interpret that because of colour blindness. So it's important to use things like borders to really draw people's attention to the things that you're focusing on, or different like kind of attributes applied to that design to bring people's focus to it. And so we built this on the Tesco product. We built this into our process right from the very beginning. This is an example of a Jira ticket where we've called out the support for dynamic text sizes, truncation rules, and voiceover support. But whose responsibility is this? Well, you know, I'm an engineer here, and I'm talking to a room full of interaction designers. Obviously, the answer is it's everybody's, which is, and I think it probably starts with you guys, right? We all have to think about this. It's going to be the developers who actually implement that voiceover support, but we have to think about how we can tailor our design to make it easier for them to support voiceover, or change our design in a specific way that makes it more accessible. So there's also other things that we can do. I'll show you this in a demo shortly. The iOS has something called this rotor, which enables you to cycle through how you navigate through elements. So typically you just go from one element to the next, but you can change it so that you go through containers, or just from one heading to the next heading, or just through buttons. And another one is actions. So an example that people might be familiar with is on the Twitter app. When you're navigating as a blind user using VoiceOver through the Twitter app, it would be really kind of disruptive to your user experience if you read one tweet and then you have to go through the retweet button and the share button and the favorite button and the copy text button, and then you get to the next tweet and you have to go through all of those buttons again before you get to the next tweet, and it would just be really jarring experience. So the way they've done it is you navigate with one swipe between each tweet and use actions, specific voiceover actions, to interact in different ways by retweeting or sharing that tweet. And so we did this as well on the Tesco app. And we actually did this based on feedback from a blind user who said when they were navigating through the list of products, they were interrupted by the promotion label, or they were interrupted by a kind of drop-down type thing, which enables them to change the weight of particular products. So we took that out and we made those custom actions so that they're not interrupted by those things. Also, there's the scrub to go back gesture, which comes for free on native navigation elements. And this is a two-fingered Z gesture. So if you're deep in a navigation stack and you just want to pop back, or close a modal or something, you just swipe with two fingers in the shape of a Z and you go back. And this is something that's familiar and expected by blind users, but doesn't come for free on certain custom elements. So the developers have to implement that. But from a design point of view, I mean, it's actually better if we could just get rid of custom alerts, because personally I don't think they look that pretty, and they're often very inaccessible. So let's just stick with out of the box native alert. It's easier to simple. It takes no design, so you can focus your design efforts elsewhere on more interesting and fun things, and it's easy to develop and it's accessible. So make it simple. Avoid using custom controls. So favor things like the native segmented control here, or favor things like the native picker controls, or the action sheets, or native switches like this. The switch is a really good example because in the accessibility settings on the device, you can enable something that highlights this in a different way. So it will show a 1 when it's turned on and a 0 over here when it's turned off, because to some people it might not be obvious that right means on and left means off, or they might not see the distinction between the colours so easily, so they don't understand that the more colourful one means on. But you only get that for free if you've used the native control in the first place, and it's familiar. So even people without accessibility, like different needs, accessibility needs, these experiences feel familiar to everybody. Again, make it simple. The running theme, number one rule. And avoid accordions. Opt for explicit navigation to reveal more content. So this read more button here will take the user to a separate screen. Rather than having an accordion which just expands in view, it can disorientate the user, sending information off the screen that they could previously see. From a web design point of view, accordions actually, not using accordions can actually improve SEO as well, so that's another kind of selling point. And ensure relevant descriptions for images. So often things like this would just have, when the screen reader is reading it, it would read out the file name, because if you haven't given it anything else to read, that's all it has available. So actually giving images specific voiceover descriptions is really important. And this is a real pet peeve of mine, and this is the reason I think carousels are bad. So going back to dynamic type and supporting different text sizes, this design looks really, really pretty, doesn't it? But when you increase the text size, you need to increase that view vertically in order to avoid truncation. Because if you truncated here, you just had dried fruit, nuts, nutrient, or nutri half of that. It wouldn't make any sense. And also, this is important for localization when you've got text that is much, much longer in different languages. So actually applying that to a design, when you have a design that looks really nice like this, you've got the chilled fruit juice and smoothies, it looks really pretty. But actually when you get real data from a real back end, it can obviously look very, very different. And then you might scroll along and you've got something that goes on to 4 lines. So how do you actually, when you're designing this, from whether you're a UI designer or a UX designer, you're thinking about this experience, and what would you do if this was on 8 lines? Would you push all of this down? Would you extend everything else so that you have a load of white space? Would you truncate because this information is so unimportant that you can replace it with an ellipsis? Or would you wrap everything else and then you end up with a load of white space like this, which doesn't look very pretty? Which is why I think a vertical list is much better than a horizontal carousel, because it means that you can, you could argue that it doesn't look as pretty. You might have a really, really elegant looking carousel, but from a simplicity point of view, these cells here can expand as much as you like vertically without impacting the user experience. So this is just as the text size gets bigger, or you've got really long bits of copy there. I have to admit that we still do use carousels in the Tesco app, and I was kind of fighting against it, but we made a rule between ourselves that we would only truncate. On our carousels, we do truncate the copy, you get an ellipsis, and we said we'll only truncate if all of that information is available in another part of the app. So the carousels are a kind of bonus feature for people that either don't care about the truncation or don't increase their font sizes, and that's just on the home screen. All of the actual information is available in full without truncation elsewhere in the app. And so thinking about who's leading the way, sadly it's not Apple. We've got things like this when we increase the font size. We've got truncation, and some people might not. I can kind of infer that this would be challenge here if they say fitness challenge, but some people might not be able to infer that, whether they're tired or have different cognitive impairments. And this one over here, I really just don't know what's happening. They haven't truncated it; they've just split it, cut it off, so it doesn't look very nice at all. So I think it's up to everybody. It's up to all of us as the user experience experts to think outside of the box. It's not even outside of the box. This is so common in web design. I don't know who here works in web or mobile. Is the kind of split? People work in both. This is just responsive design in web, but it's not so common in mobile. So just moving the price under the image when the text gets bigger, and making this a dynamic height so that it can go on to 5 or 6 lines even if necessary. So quick quiz. This is to highlight the importance of accessibility labels. So when you're using VoiceOver, you have an accessibility trait. So this is the button. It will be read out after it's read out the copy of the label. And it highlights the importance of context. So what does this change? Does anybody know? Can anybody tell me? It's a button, and it changes something. Quantity. It's the wrong answer, I'm afraid. It changed the delivery slot, but when you actually look at it on the screen, you only see the word change, but it's really obvious that it changed the delivery slot because it tells you the time and where it's being delivered to, and it's got a massive change button next to it. It's obvious. But for a blind user who doesn't have that context and is just moving their finger across the screen to hear what's being read out, the additional context is really important. But when you're designing it, the UI, you don't want to put change delivery slot because it doesn't look very pretty and it takes up too much space, and the context is already obvious because of where it's placed on the screen. So it's really important to think about additional context that you can give to blind people. And some apps sadly make no effort at all. This is an app called Citymapper, which isn't available in Edinburgh, but some people might have used it if they've been to other cities in the UK. It was rated like top travel app 2012, 13, 14, 15, I think. But they haven't even thought about accessibility at all. And it's sadly still the case to this day. So, quick demo. Bear with me. Right. Let me know if it just disappears off the screen because...
Voiceover on Facebook. Double tap to open.
Can people hear that?
Page 2 of 9. Adjustable. Groceries. Double tap to open. Groceries. Book a slot. Button.
So this is the Tesco Groceries app. And so I'm just going to show you the rotor.
Characters. Words. Speaking rate.
Speaking rate. When I was
65%.
working with a blind guy, he had it right up to 100%.
95%. 100%.
And he said if it could go faster, he would put it faster. This was a limitation for him. But
90%.
he had to turn it right down to about 60% for us to understand what he was doing. But
65%.
the reason that he could have it so fast was because hearing it was I don't know, his sense of hearing was just increased because he couldn't see anything. So he could hear absolutely everything that was being read out and really quickly. So containers. Containers, you can see I'm skipping through containers.
Words. Characters. Actions. Headings.
Headings.
Favorite. Tesco fresh cut coriander. Special offer. Any 2 for £1. Activate. The flat.
I don't know what's just happened there.
Special offer. Any 2 for £1.20. Double tap for activate. The flat. Special offer. Any 2 for £1. Headings. Favorites. Heading.
Favourites, all right.
Show all favorites.
Show all favourites. So if I go to show all my favourites.
Selected. Favorites. Button. 12 products. Button. Filter. Tesco perfectly. 0 in basket. Tesco Whitmere Farms white potato 2.5 kilograms. Favorite. £1.25. Unit price 50 pence / 0 in basket.
So I've got 0 in my basket.
2.5 kilograms. Adjustable.
And it tells me that it's adjustable.
One finger to adjust the value.
Swipe up or down with one finger to adjust the value.
went
So,
off.
0 in alert.
sorry?
When do
It went
you want
off.
this item?
What's gone off?
Your password's required.
Oh, man. Cut that bit out of the video. And so I've added this to my basket, and
Choose an upcoming order.
and I need to.
When do you want this item?
When do I want this
Choose an
item?
upcoming order or start a new one.
Okay, so this is because I've already got an order in progress that's due to be delivered. So
Friday the 22nd of November. 12 to
so I'm going to add it to that.
Opening order.
Now it's opening my order.
Changes by book a slot. Button. Alert. Product added to order.
Okay, great. So now it's added to my order. It's added to my existing order.
Whitmere Farms white potato 2.5 kilograms was added to your order. Okay. Button. Okay. Button.
Okay. And
20%.
so
Status bar item. Swipe down with 3 fingers to reveal notifications. Swipe up with 3 fingers to reveal the control center. Double tap to scroll to top.
so I'm not going to go into. I won't spend ages. I've got save changes.
Search. Tab. Cancel.
Search.
Tab. 3 of 5. Text field is editing. Search for a product. Toothbrush. Button. Chicken. Button. Bleach. Chicken. Button.
Chicken. Right, so if I have a look at what's in
648 products. Button.
chicken, loads of search results.
Filter. Button. Sort. Tesco finest British corn free range whole chicken 1 kg 2.3 kg £7.68 pence. Unit price £4.65 pence /kg. Button. Custom actions available.
Custom actions available. So if I have this set to actions,
Characters.
which
Words. Speaking rate. Containers. Headings. Actions.
so most people would have it just automatically. They've set their speaking rate. They're happy with that. They just have this set to actions, so that when they encounter a product, an element like this, they can
Selected weight £7.68 pence.
They can
1.65 kilograms. Double tap to
go
select
to
weight of
the selected, use a custom action like this, and so hopefully.
£7.68 pence per 1.6 £9.19 per 1.97 £10.70 per 2.3 kilograms. Done. Button. Tesco finest British corn free range whole chicken 1 kg 2.3 kg 0 in basket. Tesco 1 times.
So I've changed the weight of my
Total
product
and £28.65.
and I've added it to my basket. So that was
Groceries.
all I wanted to do there.
Citymapper. Double tap to open.
And then quickly show you this.
Citymapper. Button.
Sorry to anybody that works at Citymapper, but I guess shame on you. Button.
You're outside of Manchester. See all cities. Single right pointing angle quotation mark. Button. Button. Button.
No, okay. Well, I think I've proven my point.
Voiceover.
These are the native features available to users of the Tesco app. So, like I said, focusing on these to begin with, we were quickly able to support both of these. Some usage stats from our accessibility users. We've got 569 users. This is a bit old as well. I haven't been working on the project for a few months now. I took these stats before I left. But I think like it just these stats, the numbers speak volumes. 569 blind people using our app and using that voiceover support. This one was interesting. These two were interesting actually because we added the support later. So the 38,000 users, over 38,000, that were people that had this enabled at device level, that in other apps and in native apps would have seen lighter text in bolder, so it stood out more. But in our app, they weren't seeing that. So once we added the support, this is the number of users that were better off because of it. And I think it's interesting to see this. There's so many people using larger text sizes, and if you're not supporting it in your apps, if you're, it's one thing to implement it as a developer, but it actually has to be designed in such a way that that it supports larger text sizes, and you're not just thinking about things in the closed off boxes that can't expand with as text size grows. Sadly, we only go up to a certain level, and there still is 1.8% of users that have the accessibility text size turned up higher than we support. And that's something that the Tesco team might address in future. 37% of all users are taking advantage of some form of accessibility feature in our app. So that might be the dynamic text size or the voiceover or just bold text or something like that. And so arguing for what you know is right, it's often very difficult to convince your stakeholders. But I think it's our responsibility to do that. So I kind of wanted to put together a little way that you could try it. So there's 2 million people in the UK living with sight loss, 6.5 million people with mobility disability, and also it just makes life easier for everybody. So if you've ever broken a hand or an arm, or you're holding an umbrella or a coffee, I mean, if you're trying to convince your stakeholder, just ask him to use your app when he's holding a coffee or something, or she. They say you can't put a price on accessibility, but I think it is fun to try. So I kind of did a bit of maths, and if you're, I mean, obviously this is very specific to a groceries app, but these 2 million people are spending almost £6.5 billion on groceries every year. Not specifically just through the Tesco app, but if Tesco make the experience so much better than all of their competitors, then this is what they can get from it. almost 23 billion from people with mobility disabilities, and everybody, if they can really conquer that market, just because their user experience is so much simpler than everybody else's, that it makes absolutely no sense to go anywhere else, then we're talking big numbers. So when your stakeholder says, we don't have time for accessibility, we can't afford it, we don't want to invest in it, say, you don't have time for 200 billion pounds? This is green pounds as well, we're talking like real pounds. And so make it simple, put it in a language that they understand. Why I care about accessibility and why I think you should too. It really simple. I don't want to take ability for granted. I don't wear glasses. I don't know, maybe one day I'll have to. I have 10 fingers and I have very good dexterity, but I might not one day. I don't want to take any of that for granted. And also, I think I'm in a very privileged position to work in tech, and I think we all are here. We get paid a lot to do what we do, and we make products that should be usable by everybody. So I think we have to kind of ally with people that find it more difficult to use technology products and really tailor those products to that market. And when you do it right, it is so motivating to keep doing it, because you get reviews like this. Like a 5-star review at the best of times is good, but when someone says, if only you knew what this means to me, it's really incredible. And that's only one 5-star review from hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of people rating our app for its accessibility. So this wonderful new app for blind users could not rate this app highly enough. This user's completely blind, and it's refreshing to see how much focus we've put on it. This person says that they've got their independence and dignity back. They're disabled in bed and need to get their food delivered to them. The latest incarnation is a huge improvement, because we rebuilt the app from scratch. It hadn't previously, they hadn't thought about accessibility before that, and this has addressed a lot of those needs. And this is a nice one to end it on. Completely blind can do this sitting in bed at 10 o'clock at night. I think it's absolutely fantastic. What they've done with the product organisation is brilliant. It's just made it much simpler. So in summary, I want to give you some takeaways. Thank you very much for listening. Marty, thank you for hosting. Alan, thank you for recording. Michael, thank you for your talk earlier, and Graham, both really insightful talks. So I want to give you something to take away. Make it simple. Don't be fooled. Simplicity requires a lot of effort. And I haven't put keep it simple here. You have to make it simple. You have to go to that effort to really, really make it simple. Keep it native. Just use native controls and alerts for familiarity for all of your users, especially people with accessibility needs. Avoid carousels and accordions. They're inherently inaccessible, and you should always opt for content that expands in the direction of scroll, so vertically, as you're in a vertically scrolling list. And fight for what you know is right. It's up to us as the user experience experts. If you would like any more information, I recommend these guys. I have no affiliation with them, but they could probably do with a bit of free advertising. They came to meet us in London and ran an all-day session with us with people with varying accessibility needs, and it was so insightful, and I really, really recommend organising something like that for your team or your company. Thank you very much. Any questions?
What's the next app you're getting involved in?
What's the next app? It's a really good question. I don't know. So Tab has just recently launched in Edinburgh, about 200 people in London. And I've just moved up here with my family 6 weeks ago, and we're in a new office on George Street. And Tesco, yeah, we work with a lot of household names like Tesco and Kingfisher, which own B&Q, RBS and Shell and Ford, and I could go on. They're kind of all the names that you know. And we're hoping to do the same in Edinburgh.
Wow, cool.
Yeah, Michael.
So just curious how Tesco took on board the legislation, or was that part of their thinking? Did they relate to it at all, and where we are in terms of how people are adapting to this legislation?
Which legislation in particular are you referring to?
There was something about new websites, public websites, government websites had to be
Yeah, AA standard on the WCAG, which is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Yeah.
This goes way beyond that, obviously, but was that something that?
Yeah. So I think like so WCAG comes in various versions. I think 2.2 is the latest, and I think 2.2 is the first one to actually call out mobile specifically. We went over all of the guidelines, and we were trying to before 2.2 came out, we were trying to interpret the web content guidelines for mobile. So yeah, does that answer your question at all?
Yeah, kind of. Or, it'd be good to know just sort of what big organisations they get, how much importance they're putting on it, or does it help get the attention on it?
I think having those guidelines is really useful.
From the guy, and then the Supreme Court said, no, actually you do.
Yeah.
And so, it's really empowered, I think, especially in the US.
I think there's been a lot of controversy over it, and over whether there'll be a load of repeat cases of people just trying to get money out of massive corporations, but it's not about that at all. It's about like fighting for what you believe is right, and making a case against a company like Domino's that should really know what's right and should be doing it right, but have neglected it all of this time. So it will give other companies a kick up the arse, probably. Any other questions? Yeah.
You talked about like the native features. Does that make hybrid apps much harder to make accessible?
It does to some extent, yeah. So I think there's some articles that say using React Native is like really inaccessible. There's things that you can do, but obviously it just requires a lot more effort. You get so much accessibility for free when you're using native. Yeah.
How long did it take you to learn how to do that on the phone? Use the accessibility tool?
I was a bit rusty today because I haven't used the Tesco app with a blindfold in a while. I was working on that particular app for about a year and a half, and every feature that we did, I wasn't blindfolding myself every time because I wasn't trying to prove a point, but I was using the app with my eyes closed. So it just came over time. But it was really, really amazing to see someone that was actually blind using the app and reporting back on how he found our user experience. He flew through his phone so much quicker than I use my phone. And he, it's interesting, Graham, what you said about listening to, like, as if it's a podcast, with just having it read out a screen. Like, he would fly through articles because he'd have it all being read out to him. He said, like, terms and conditions, he actually listens, he actually interprets them, whereas nobody else does, because he can hear like a million miles an hour, basically.
Do you teach yourself how to use the app, or did somebody teach you the accessibility tools?
I taught myself that, but there were things like that. I didn't actually show you in the demo, sorry, but the Z scrub to go back gesture. Like, there are certain things that blind users would expect, and I wasn't aware of. So that, again, like, that was another reason why the training was really insightful. Yeah.
It sounds like something you're pretty passionate about accessibility, but I guess in the context of this project and maybe in other projects, was this an initiative from Tesco to implement accessibility, or was this something from Tab or from yourself to really push for this?
It was.
New app?
It was. There's a guy in Tab who's kind of championed the move towards this. Probably about 2 years ago, he started really getting behind it. He's a tester, and he was working with me on the project. So it was him that was bringing up the WCAG guidelines and trying to interpret them for mobile and saying this is what we should do. We should be going towards. And he was passionate about it, and he just got the whole team passionate about it. And yeah, it is that sort of thing that once you start thinking about it, You know, I was just an app developer. I just made apps and didn't really think about who was using them. But then when you really do start thinking about it, you do get really passionate about it because you get amazing reviews like that, and you start to just think a little bit more about how you want everybody to use your app. You know, if you're building a website or designing a website or a product, whether it's a digital product or anything else, if you then find users that can't use it because of something that you've done, you know, foresight on your part, then you're going to be upset about it, aren't you? But yeah, I just think we're kind of, we're all very, very similar people, really. We might look different, but we all probably think the same. We're designers and developers. We work in the technology world, but because we all kind of look the same and think the same, it can lead to designing the same and building the same, and all of our products would be the same. So we have to start thinking differently and actually putting ourselves in the shoes of our users who have so many different, like at the start of this, I asked who used accessibility features, and nobody did, other than because their phone's broken and because they want to listen to news articles being read out. So obviously we're all quite similar people, and we really have to put ourselves into the shoes of people with different needs.
Is retrofitting accessibility features an option, or is it something you really have to do at the beginning?
It is an option, yeah. And if you are thinking like you're going to go away from this and think, I've been inspired, I definitely think you should consider it. But it obviously helps if you're thinking about it from the beginning, because in the interest of time, I didn't actually do the full demo that I wanted to on my phone, but there's one, I mean, if anybody wants to speak to me afterwards, I can show you. There's a date picker on when you're picking when you want your groceries to be delivered. And this is a custom component that you swipe along from left to right. And when we first implemented that, navigating through the elements, you'd navigate from tomorrow, the next day, the next day, the next day, the next day, and you'd have to go through 3 weeks of available dates before you'd get down to the next element, the next container on the screen, which was the actual hour slots on the date that you've selected. That's a bad experience. So instead of having to force the user to have to go through all of those different dates, we made that into a custom control which they could interact with by swiping up and down instead of left to right. So then they discover that control, and immediately by swiping one to the right, they are in the actual content below it. And it calls out, it says this is an adjustable component, and adjustable means use up and down swipes to control it, which is what we have on the basket quantity as well. It says it's adjustable. You swipe up and down to control it.
What they call it there.
Yeah.
So thanks again for the talk.
Cool. I appreciate we ran probably the longest we've done for a meetup, so there's probably a little time to kind of hang around afterwards. But thanks again for coming along. Those were 3 pretty insightful talks. I'm sure the speakers are up for engaging on social media, that kind of thing. Also, I said about the State of Scotland's UX report. Is hands up who wouldn't be keen on putting into that or completing the survey?
Gordon?
So what's that?
You said Gordon?
Who wouldn't? So I was just trying to figure out if there's any reason people wouldn't want to like putting in data to say what they do in this kind of industry and stuff. But if there's not, that's great. And I'll push that out in the next couple of days. Also, I'll bring Alan up quickly to talk about a hackathon that Product Forge are doing. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, it'll be super fast.
Yeah, go for it.
Every year we organise a big health hackathon in Edinburgh. It's Europe's largest health hackathon now. It's a 4-day event that brings together healthcare professionals, developers, data scientists and designers to develop new digital health products. We take you through the whole product design process, from customer discovery all the way through to prototyping, and we are super keen to get more UX designers along because you make everything better. And if you're interested in applying your skills to healthcare, you can check out the event on productforge.io. We're at Productforge on Twitter, and the event is 20th to 23rd of February. Thank you very much.
Cool. So if you haven't heard of the hackathon or haven't been to it, I've been a few times and it's absolutely great. I mean, the causes, the sponsors that they work with to do these hackathons, it's all great reasons for doing it, and it brings a lot of people together, people from university, people in our kind of roles out there in industry. They just go for a weekend and they're able to just work on something that they're really able to kind of grasp and get into. So I'd really kind of prompt that. But overall, thanks a lot for coming again. Graham, are we just kind of aiming to shoot out now? 9 o'clock?
Not far off, yeah.
Yeah, cool, right. So if you want to grab a slice of pizza as we're going out type thing, that's great. But 4th of December, we've got our next event, and I'll try and manage the time a lot better. But thanks again for coming along.